pilot didn't hesitate. Somewhere over the Gulf of Oman, a U.S. Navy FC-18 Super Hornet rolled in on an Iranian-flagged oil tanker, not to sink it, not to warn it, but to surgically remove its ability to move. One precise burst from a 20mm cannon, rudder gone, ship dead in the water. That happened on May 8, 2026. And here is the question most people aren't asking: why disable instead of destroy? Why a cannon instead of a missile? Why target the rudder and the smokestack? Two systems that stop a ship but leave it floating, because this wasn't combat. This was a message written in steel. And if you understand what that message actually says and who it's really aimed at, the entire Hormuz crisis looks completely different than what you've been told. Let's go back to the beginning, because the tanker strike didn't start in May. It started on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated air campaign that, within hours, killed Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and decapitated the upper tier of the IRGC command structure. It was the most consequential military strike in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq, and it triggered something the Pentagon had war-gamed for years, but hoped would never actually happen. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, not symbolically, not rhetorically, physically. Mines in the water, IRGC fast boats swarming commercial shipping lanes, drone and missile batteries repositioned along the northern coastline. The Persian Gulf, the body of water through which roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil supply moves every single day, became a combat zone overnight. Within weeks, over 2,000 commercial vessels were trapped, 20,000 mariners stuck inside a maritime kill box with no safe exit. Brent crude spiked to $126 a barrel. Shipping insurers pulled coverage. Global supply chains began seizing up. And here is the first thing you need to understand about what followed. The United States didn't respond by going to war with Iran's navy. It responded by establishing a blockade. On April 13th, CENTCOM announced a naval exclusion zone around Iranian ports, effectively cutting off Iran's ability to export oil while also preventing incoming supplies from reaching the country. Every vessel attempting to break that blockade was subject to interdiction. That is the legal and operational framework inside which those FCA-18s fired. But here's where it gets more complicated. A blockade is not a battle. A blockade is a slow, grinding campaign of attrition that plays out over weeks and months. It requires constant naval presence, constant surveillance, and most critically, constant credibility. The moment a blockade nation fails to enforce its own rules, the blockade collapses. Not militarily, politically, economically. Every tanker that slips through is a crack in the wall. So when 3 Iranian-flagged tankers attempted to reach Iranian ports in early May, the US Navy had 2 choices. Let them pass and signal that the blockade has soft edges, or stop them visibly, undeniably, on camera, and demonstrate that the rules are absolute. They chose to stop them, and they chose to do it in a very specific way. The first tanker, targeted by an FC-18 from the USS Abraham Lincoln, had its rudder disabled by cannon fire, not a harpoon missile, not a jam, a cannon. That choice matters enormously. A cannon engagement requires the pilot to fly close, slow, and low. It is loud, it is visible, it leaves no ambiguity about what happened and who did it. The Pentagon then released declassified footage of the strikes. This was theater, calculated, deliberate, high-stakes theater. And the audience wasn't just Iran. This is the first major reinterpretation the mainstream coverage missed entirely. The visible target was the Iranian tanker, but the actual audience for that strike footage was every other nation watching from the sidelines. Every shipping company, every oil trader, every Gulf state monarch, every adversary watching to see whether American red lines hold under pressure. Because here is the strategic reality of the Hormuz crisis that rarely gets stated plainly. The United States is not just fighting Iran. It is fighting a credibility war with the entire world simultaneously. China is watching to see whether US naval power can sustain a prolonged blockade operation far from American shores. Russia is watching to see whether domestic political pressure forces Washington to blink. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, home to the US, Fifth Fleet, are watching to see whether they made the right bet by allowing American forces to operate from their territory. And every potential adversary from the Taiwan Strait to the Baltic Sea is running calculations right now based on what they observe in Hormuz. When that FCA-18 pilot fired his cannon at an oil tanker's rudder, he was not just stopping one ship. He was sending a message to every one of those audiences at once. That is not a show of force. That is a clock ticking for every nation that thought America might hesitate. Now let's talk about the operational picture beneath the surface. Because what you see on satellite imagery and in Pentagon press releases is only a fraction of what's actually happening in that stretch of water. The U.S. Navy currently has 2 carrier strike groups operating in or near the Arabian Sea, the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS George H.W. Bush. Each carrier strike group consists of the carrier itself, 2 guided missile cruisers, 2 or 3 destroyers, a fast attack submarine, and a logistics vessel. That's roughly 15 to 18 warships per group. Combined, they represent the most concentrated projection of American naval air power since the Gulf War. Each carrier can generate somewhere between 100 and 120 sorties per day under sustained combat tempo. But here's the constraint that never makes the headlines. You cannot sustain that tempo indefinitely. Aircraft need maintenance. Pilots need rest. Ordnance needs replenishment. Every day of high-intensity operations burns through jet fuel, spare parts, and aircrew readiness in ways that don't reset overnight. The Abraham Lincoln has been on deployment since late 2025. By May 2026, that ship has been at sea for months. Maintenance backlogs build quietly. Sortie generation rates begin to compress. The crew is tired even when they won't admit it. This is the hidden constraint inside the visible power. The carriers look invincible from the outside. From the inside, every department head is managing a clock, and Iran's commanders know this. They have studied American carrier operations for 40 years. They know the maintenance cycle. They know the deployment rhythms. They know that every month a carrier stays on station, its operational margin shrinks slightly, which brings us to Iran's actual strategy in this crisis, because it is more sophisticated than most Western coverage suggests. Iran did not attempt to sink the carriers. It did not launch a mass missile barrage at the Fifth Fleet's home port in Bahrain. It did not try to directly fight the US Navy in open water, which would be suicidal. Instead, Iran did something more patient and more dangerous. It created a permanent state of operational friction. Mines in shipping lanes force constant minesweeping operations. Slow, dangerous, resource-intensive. IRGC fast boats harassing merchant shipping require surface combatants to respond, pulling destroyers away from carrier escort duties. Drone swarms launched from Iranian coastal positions force continuous air defense readiness, burning through interceptor missiles that are not easily replaced at sea. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority, established by Iran on May 5th, gave Tehran a pseudo-legal framework to claim sovereignty over Hormuz traffic, meaning any U.S. interdiction can be framed internationally as an act of aggression against a recognized maritime authority. Iran is not trying to win a naval battle. Iran is trying to make the cost of maintaining the blockade too high to sustain politically. That is a completely different war than the one the media is covering. Now here is where the picture gets even sharper, and where the tanker strikes on May 8th and 9th reveal something critical about the moment we are actually in. 3 tankers in 2 days. Pentagon releases footage within 24 hours. CENTCOM issues statements emphasizing the legality under the established blockade framework. President Trump publicly warns of total destruction if U.S. assets are targeted. Secretary of State Rubio simultaneously signals openness to a diplomatic resolution, pressure on one channel, dialogue on the other. Escalation and off-ramp presented simultaneously. This is a textbook coercive diplomacy playbook. The United States is not trying to destroy Iran's oil infrastructure in one decisive blow. It is trying to convince Iran's new leadership, whoever has consolidated power after Khamenei's death, that continued resistance costs more than negotiated settlement. But here is the timing problem at the center of this entire crisis, and it is the variable that changes everything. Iran does not yet have a stable successor government. Khamenei is dead. The IRGC command structure was disrupted in the initial strikes. Factions are competing internally for control. There is no single decision maker in Tehran right now with the authority and the legitimacy to agree to a ceasefire and make it stick, which means the United States is applying coercive pressure to a government that may not have the internal cohesion to respond to it. You cannot negotiate a surrender with a command structure that is still fighting over who is in charge. This is the trap, not for Iran. For Washington, every day the blockade continues without a diplomatic resolution, the risk of miscalculation grows. The ceasefire agreed in early April was never fully implemented. Both sides claim it is still in force. Both sides are conducting kinetic operations inside it. This is not peace. This is a frozen conflict with live ammunition, and frozen conflicts have a failure mode that is well documented in military history. They break not through deliberate decision, but through incident. A tanker captain who doesn't receive the order to stop. A pilot who misidentifies a vessel. A fast boat crew that panics and fires first. A drone that malfunctions and strikes the wrong target. The most dangerous moment in this crisis is not a planned escalation. It is an accident that neither side wanted, but neither side can walk back without looking weak in front of the audience that is always watching. The USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group has been operating under continuous threat posture for months. Every radar contact is evaluated, every unknown vessel is tracked, every unidentified aircraft is queried. The cognitive load on the crews of those ships, the watch officers, the air defense coordinators, the sonar operators on the attack submarines operating below, is immense. Fatigue increases error rates. High operational tempo compresses decision time. And in the Strait of Hormuz, the radar horizon is measured in miles, not minutes. A threat can go from detected to critical in under 90 seconds. That is not a margin that allows for careful deliberation. That is a margin that relies entirely on pre-built doctrine and split-second pattern recognition. And doctrine was written for a different operating environment. Here is the final layer, the one that converts this tactical story into its full strategic meaning. The 2026 Hormuz Crisis is not fundamentally about Iran. It is about the future architecture of global maritime order. For 70 years, the United States Navy has functioned as the guarantor of freedom of navigation across the world's critical sea lanes: the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, the Strait of Malacca, the Eastern Mediterranean. The principle has always been the same. International waters belong to everyone. No single nation has the right to close a global choke point, and the U.S. Navy will enforce that principle by force if necessary. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the most direct challenge to that principle since World War II. Not because Iran is a superpower, it isn't, but because of what it proves is possible. If a mid-tier regional power can close one of the world's most critical maritime choke points and hold it closed for weeks while the international community watches, then the entire framework of American maritime primacy is in question. Beijing is taking notes. North Korea is taking notes. Every nation that has ever wanted to contest American naval dominance in its own region is watching the Hormuz crisis as a proof of concept. The US Navy knows this, which is why the response has been measured but relentless. Every disabled tanker, every released video, every CENTCOM statement is calibrated not just to pressure Iran, but to demonstrate to the entire world that the blockade holds, that the rules still apply, and that American naval power is not a bluff. The carrier doesn't just project force, it projects the credibility of a system. And the system is only as strong as the last time it was tested. On May 9, 2026, a US Navy pilot fired a cannon at an oil tanker smokestack in the Gulf of Oman. Most people saw a military confrontation. What they were actually watching was the United States Navy writing one more line in a document that has been in progress for 70 years. The standing order that says the sea lanes stay open, the rules hold, and the price of defiance is visible, certain, and immediate. But the document is under stress. The blockade is real, the carriers are tired, the command in Tehran is fractured, and the ceasefire is a fiction held together by competing interests on both sides. Somewhere in the Arabian Sea right now, a watch officer on a guided missile destroyer is tracking contacts on a radar screen, running threat assessments in real time, knowing that the next decision in this crisis may not come from a general or a diplomat. It may come from him, in under 90 seconds. That is where the Hormuz crisis actually lives. Not in the headlines, not in the press conference, in the gap between what doctrine assumes and what combat conditions deliver. And that gap is closing.